PowerPoint for Chapter 32, specifically 32.2, details on the endocrine system. Five different types of intercellular signaling will lead us into the details of the endocrine system. So one type of cell signaling is the endocrine signaling. So endocrine is where a cell releases a hormone or a chemical, and that chemical or hormone is going to enter the bloodstream, make its way to another cell, and this other cell, the receiving cell, or targeted cell, must have a specific receptor on its outside. And once the chemical or hormone binds to the receptor on the outside, then we're going to see some sort of a cellular response. Another type of intercellular signaling is the paracrine signaling. Paracrine is cell-to-cell communication, but it would be direct. There's no bloodstream in between. And again, a cell releases a chemical, and it's also received by a target cell, still needing the specific protein receptor on the outside, and then we get a response. A third type is autocrine signaling. Autocrine is, again, a cell that releases a chemical, but in this case, it doesn't make its way to a different target cell. The target cell is itself, and then the cell is able to have some sort of a response. A fourth type is synaptic signaling. Synaptic is similar to paracrine, but there's a synapse, which is between the cells. And you can see the diagram where, again, there has to be a receptor, and then we get a response. Now, an example here to clarify, when there's a neuron involved, this would be, again, like a neurological message sent to the muscles. That would be a perfect example of synaptic signaling. The last type is neuroendocrine. So neurons are in play with this one as well, but in this case, neurons, they still have to receive the signal, and the blood vessels or bloodstream is involved, because that's where the hormones are going to be released to then again make its way to a targeted cell. So I've mentioned endocrine system a few different times. What exactly is the endocrine system? So these are tissues, cells that secrete hormones. The endocrine system is made of glands. So glands are ductless. They secrete the hormones and directly into different kinds of body fluids. So I think a slide PowerPoint ago, I said what hormones are. Make sure you know, again, what hormones are. These are chemical signals or molecules that cause a response in a targeted cell. And typically the targeted cell must have a receptor protein for specific hormones. So again, similar to a key and a lock. Hormones can be specific to just one tissue. They can be specific for a few different types of tissues, or there can be hormones that actually affect most tissues in the body. They can also affect other endocrine glands, so it would be like a domino effect. Now, how is the system with hormones being released or not released regulated? By positive and negative feedback. So again, just a reminder, most systems are going to operate like with negative feedback. So in this case, more gets less. So more of a signal is going to get you less of the response. Positive feedback is where more of a signal is going to get you more of something. These are all the different kinds of glands that make up the endocrine system. You don't have to know, and could you imagine having to memorize all the different types of hormones that are released? You do not need to. There will be a few that I'm going to discuss in the upcoming slides, but definitely be familiar with the different types of glands. So starting in kind of the general location of them as well. So starting up at the top, I'll just move like clockwise. The thyroid gland in like the base of the throat, pineal gland within like the brain or the skull, hypothalamus, same within, again, the skull, pituitary gland, again, up in our head, others, pancreas, again, in our torso, testes, ovaries, we know that's a part in our reproductive area, adrenal glands, again, within our torso, and then parathyroid, I probably should have mentioned that earlier, again, within our throat. I will go over exactly what hormones do you need to know with these different glands, but for now, just be familiar with the name and the general location. This is an example of a simple endocrine pathway and how it operates with negative feedback. So part of our digestive system, working together with the pancreas and the endocrine system, all working together. So we have a low pH going on in parts of our digestive system. The duodenum is the beginning of the small intestine, I believe it is. And this part, when there's food that arrives that needs to be digested, it realizes that there's a low pH, and there's typically a high pH taking place. So because there's a difference going on, in order for food to be digested, there has to be an increase in pH. So the endocrine cells receive a message from the duodenum, and it releases a hormone into the bloodstream. These chemicals are going to make their way to the pancreas, which is the targeted area, and the pancreas, which is located near the stomach, is going to then release a chemical. So again, it's like a domino effect of these systems working together. The pancreas releases, which the pancreas cells are the targeted cells, they are going to release bicarbonate, which will allow for an increase in pH in the stomach and allow the food to get digested. Now, how is this negative feedback? Because the response of that bicarbonate being released, it is no longer having such a low pH. So the stimulus that would trigger the endocrine cells to release the chemical has been told to basically stop. So in this case, more, again, is going to get you less, and it's going to be shut down. And that's where it's negative feedback. If for some reason I was unclear in my description, please read through it. It's on page 670 to get a little bit more details. An example of a simple neuroendocrine pathway and an example of how positive feedback works is breastfeeding. So when you have a baby, whether it's a mammal or a person, when the baby is actually breastfeeding, there are nerves, obviously, in the breast and within the nipple that receive a message that breastfeeding is taking place. From that, those neurons send an impulse to the hypothalamus, which again is a gland of the endocrine system within the head. And the hypothalamus receives this message that breastfeeding is taking place, and it releases a hormone known as oxytocin, or it triggers the release of oxytocin to be given off from the pituitary gland. And in this case, that message of oxytocin being given off, circulating through the body, it is received by the mammary glands. And the more of the oxytocin that is received by the mammary glands within the breast, is going to trigger more milk to be released. And then again, the baby is going to eat, and then the whole process takes place all over again. So again, being a little bit familiar that again, it doesn't just have to be local. Again, there's a neurological, again, response that's received in the brain, and it kind of, sends a message to other parts of the body. And that's basically what the neuroendocrine, in this case, pathway is. I did want to say, again, in this case, positive feedback, more gets more. So again, the more the baby feeds, the more that this is going to take place. Even though we aren't memorizing all the different types and names of the hormones, you should know that there are two main groups of hormones, peptide versus steroid hormones. And peptide hormones are water soluble. Peptide hormones bind to receptors on the plasma membrane and triggers a signal of transduction. Steroid hormones are lipid soluble. They enter the cell and bind to intracellular receptors. So different than the transduction, intracellular is going to be within the cell itself. Peptide hormones affect protein activity, and they're already present in the cell. And steroid causes change in gene expression via protein synthesis, being different. Peptide, they're water soluble, which we know our bodies are mostly made of water. So there is a rapid response, but they are short-lived because they do dissolve in water. Steroid hormones have a slower response and a longer life. And to give some examples of the two different types, oxytocin, insulin, and epinephrine, those are peptide hormones. Things like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, thyroid hormones, those are steroid hormones. And again, they have a slower response and a longer life. Here's a picture showing you the difference between a peptide water-soluble hormone versus a steroid and lipid-soluble hormone and how they move around to the targeted cell. You can see peptides, they get excreted and they're water-soluble, so they can float about, they can go into the bloodstream, they can make their way to a targeted cell thanks to a receptor. So again, it has to fit like a key in a lock, and from that, the receptor on the outside of the targeted cell is going to have some type of response right away, whether it's gene regulation or just something going on within the cell, because the hormone was received on the outside of that targeted cell. Steroid hormones, they're not able to move as free as the water-soluble peptide hormones are able to move. So lipid-soluble hormones, they cannot just kind of make their way through the blood. They need a transport protein to help them out. And once they have, thanks to the help of other types of proteins, once it's able to get into the targeted cell, then within the cell itself, there's going to be a receptor for it. And inside the nucleus is typically where this takes place, and then gene regulation, protein synthesis can be undergone or can take place. And then from that, a response. Please watch this video. I'll try to include a link in the description of the next YouTube video lecture. I don't know if I can figure out how to do it. Otherwise, I copied it right here so that way you can watch it. It's about 4 minutes. The fight or flight hormone, adrenaline, or known as epinephrine, is one hormone that can have many different effects. Now, how can one hormone have so many different effects in different cells? So it has to do with the receptors that epinephrine is binding to on the outside of the cell. It can be different. And on the inside, the intracellular proteins inside are different. So they're going to do different things for the cell when that epinephrine is received on the outside. So some examples, again on page 672, if you want to learn more about this diagram, but very briefly, liver cells break down glycogen and release glucose when epinephrine is received on the outside with a certain type of receptor. The same type of receptor is on the outside of muscle cells, but when the epinephrine is received, the cell is going to relax thanks to the proteins on the inside being different. Another example is a different receptor on the outside of muscle cells again. So epinephrine can be received by a different receptor, and in this case, the blood vessels are going to constrict. So in this case, when we have that adrenaline rush, the epinephrine rush, blood glucose needs to skyrocket, which is what's being shown in the first example. We also need blood flow to increase to our muscles, which is in the second column or picture. And then we need blood flow in our digestion to stop, and that's why the cell is contracting, because certainly you don't want to vomit as often we feel sometimes when we have that adrenaline rush. So one hormone can have many different effects when we experience that fight or flight response. Something I forgot to mention on the last slide about epinephrine or adrenaline, it is produced by the adrenal glands, which are right on top of the kidneys. Two glands that you need to be familiar with the endocrine system and the hormones that they produce is the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland, it has two parts to it. But if you look at the picture, the posterior pituitary gland is actually an extension of the hypothalamus, which is going to synthesize different hormones. And then the posterior pituitary gland stores up these hormones. The anterior pituitary gland actually synthesizes and secretes hormones on its own. So even though pituitary has two parts, it's almost like the posterior part is an extension of the hypothalamus. So these two glands operate with a neuroendocrine pathway. So the hypothalamus receives information from the nerves and the brain, and it's going to initiate endocrine signals. And it works hand in hand then with the pituitary gland. So it initiates endocrine signals, posterior pituitary gland versus the anterior pituitary gland, two hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary gland are oxytocin, which I think I mentioned in a prior slide or slideshow. Oxytocin contracts uterine muscles. It also ejects milk in nursing or helps with that process. Another hormone, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, promotes water retention by the kidneys. The pituitary gland synthesizes FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, which is responsible for the development of ovarian follicles, which are also known as eggs, and also promotes sperm production in males. Another hormone that is synthesized and released by the anterior pituitary gland is LH, luteinizing hormone, which triggers ovulation and stimulates testosterone production in the testes. This is just a visual of the hypothalamus working together with the posterior pituitary gland to produce ADH, which targets kidneys for, again, water retention, and oxytocin, which is going to target mammary glands and uterine muscles. The hypothalamus working together with the interior pituitary gland is a little bit more complex, and you can see there's a lot more hormones that are synthesized and released by the interior pituitary gland. But the only two in which I want you to know are the hormones FSH and LH, again targeting the puberty, basically, of the testes and ovaries. Here is another video I'd like you to watch. It's 5 minutes long, going over homeostasis and blood sugar. I'll try to put the link again in the description of the video PowerPoint when I upload it. Insulin and glucagon help to control blood glucose levels. So homeostasis for blood glucose levels is 70 to 110 milligrams. So after we eat a really large meal, I'm going to be talking about the top part of this diagram. When we eat a really large meal, our blood glucose levels skyrocket, especially if we eat anything that's carbohydrate rich. So from this, our pancreas is going to then be signaled to release insulin into our bloodstream. Once insulin is floating around in our blood along with that glucose, it is going to help our body to take up more glucose, removing it from our bloodstream. It'll also allow the liver to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. So from that, when insulin helps the glucose to be removed from the bloodstream, our blood glucose levels are going to decline back into that homeostasis safe level. Now, if we haven't eaten, if we've skipped a meal, haven't eaten in a while, our blood glucose levels are very low. Our pancreas is going to release glucagon, into the blood, which again is complex carbohydrates, complex glycogen bonded together. It's going to then be released into the bloodstream, and the liver is going to break down this glycogen and essentially turn it into glucose, which will then make its way into our blood. And then from that, our blood glucose levels have risen back into that safe homeostatic level. Here's another diagram, I think a little more simplified, of what's going on when there's high blood glucose levels. So again, high blood glucose levels, insulin is released from the pancreas, body cells take up glucose, or the liver stores glucose as glycogen, blood glucose levels drop. Glucagon can be released from the pancreas. The liver will break down that glycogen and release the glucose into the bloodstream, and then we have higher blood glucose levels. So it certainly can be a cycle, a control of blood glucose. There are two types of diabetes, which we read about in Survival of the Sickest. Type 1 diabetes, affecting about 10% of the population, is where there's a deficiency of insulin. So the people who have type 1 are insulin dependent, and it's an autoimmune disorder. Beta cells of pancreas are destroyed, and they no longer are able to release insulin. The other type is type 2 diabetes, which is about 90% of the population. It's a failure of target cells to respond to insulin. These people are non-insulin dependent. Insulin is produced, but again, the cells do not respond. So there's a defect in insulin receptors or the pathway. Risk factors from having type 2 diabetes, obesity, and a lack of exercise, which would then lead to obesity, which can lead to type 2 diabetes, can be a factor of having these target cells not respond to insulin correctly. Here is another example of negative feedback in how the thyroid gland regulates metabolism. So first, there is a thyroid hormone level drop that is detected by the hypothalamus. Neurosecretory cells secrete a hormone, TRH, into the bloodstream. And the TRH travels to the anterior pituitary and causes it to release another hormone known as TSH. TSH stimulates the endocrine cells in the thyroid. Again, this is the gland that's located in our neck region, and it's going to secrete T3 and T4, another hormone. T3 and T4 levels increase in the blood and body tissues, and body tissues act on target cells throughout the body. T3 and T4 levels return to normal range. Thyroid hormone blocks further. TRH and TSH release, and then that message is sent to stop this process, and that's what makes it negative feedback. So what exactly do you need to know about all these crazy different abbreviated names? Please make sure that you know that the thyroid gland is responsible for basic metabolism in our body's muscle tone, blood pressure, heart rate, digestive, and reproductive functions. So it's really important that this gland operates, and it includes other parts of the endocrine system. Again, the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary. Again, many of these body processes, again, I keep saying this, but it's like a domino effect. And in this case, the domino effect is stopped, though, with negative feedback. Sometimes homeostasis doesn't quite pan out, and there is an imbalance. Graves' disease is an example of this, piggybacking on the last slide with the thyroid. So Graves' disease is an autoimmune disorder. Antibodies bind to TSH receptor. So now we have a problem with one of the hormones being received appropriately. Hyperthyroidism is an overproduction of T3 and T4 hormones. There is a bypass of the TSH negative feedback loop. So the feedback loop being told that the initial level of the hormone has dropped below the normal range is no longer being received. So from that, there's just an overproduction of T3 and T4 into the circulatory system from the thyroid gland. Now, because it's not being told to stop, the person with Graves' disease experiences high temperatures, sweating, weight loss, high blood pressure, and also their eyes sometimes have, if you look at the picture, a little bit of a bulging or bug-like eyes, and that's an indicator the person can be suffering from Graves' disease. Here's another example of homeostatic imbalance from that pathway which I described 2 slides ago with the hypothalamus, pituitary, and the thyroid gland. An example is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So another type of autoimmune disorder. And now the antibodies are targeting incorrectly the thyroid gland. And there's from that a low level of the thyroid hormone. So then TSH levels rise, and this is known as, or one case of this is hypothyroidism. So an overworking thyroid. And the person experiences low temperature, they often gain lots of weight, they are sluggish, and they have a lower than normal heart rate. From this diagram, I really like that it's showing kind of the starting at the hypothalamus, that THR is produced, anterior pituitary receives the signal, makes TSH, then that gets its way to the thyroid gland, and that T3 and T4 are another hormone that is produced. So if for you taking notes, if you're taking notes, even though this is giving you an exact example of an autoimmune disorder, I would probably copy this pathway down with the ovals and the arrows showing the hormones and where they're going.